Support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Oshman Family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Oshman Family JCC is an incubator for new expressions of Jewish identity. It creates innovative Jewish learning, celebrations, and arts programs that inspire personal connections to people and ideas from across the Jewish world. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. This is Judaism Unbound, episode 195. Judaisms? Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rothberg.
And as we get closer to the end than to the beginning of this series on Jewish education, I'm hearkening back to our interview with Sarah Hurwitz, which was basically the prequel to this series. In her book, Here All Along, Sarah Hurwitz writes about the process of coming to Jewish education as an adult and experiencing Judaism and Jewish education very differently from that perspective. While I wouldn't necessarily say that Sarah's experience is common, it's also not so uncommon these days because a lot of Jews who are coming from a Jewish educational experience in childhood that was less than optimal are getting a new bite at that Jewish education apple when they come to college and have the opportunity to take Jewish studies courses. So today we're excited to talk to a professor of Jewish studies. Our guest is Hahn Tapper. He is the May and Benjamin Swig Professor in Jewish Studies at the University of San Francisco and the founding director of the Swig Program in Jewish Studies and Social Justice. Hahn Tapper is also the author of a book called Judaisms, a 21st century introduction to Jews and Jewish identities. You may hear the resonance to our interview about a year ago with Daniel Boyarin, the author of a book called Judaism, the Genealogy of a Modern Notion. Both books take on this question of the notion that we have that Judaism means a very particular, a very singular thing. The book Judaisms examines how Jews are a culture, ethnicity, nation, nationality, race, religion, and more. The book weaves together alternative and marginalized voices to illustrate how Jews have always been in the process of reshaping their customs, practices, and beliefs. As such, Judaisms is the first book to assess and summarize Jewish history from the time of the Hebrew Bible through today using multiple perspectives. As you can imagine, that perspective is particularly interesting to us here on Judaism Unbound. So we're excited to jump into this conversation both about the potential of college, the potential of Jewish studies courses at college to be seen as a version, as a form of Jewish education. Not all professors are necessarily thrilled about that, as we'll discuss. But it may be a new reality of Jewish life, and there may be some real benefits from the perspective of Judaism Unbound and our interests. And as we jump into the substance of the conversation about the book Judaisms and the ideas that Hahn Tapper is putting out there, we think it's an opportunity to see what a Jewish education that comes from the academy, from the university, how that might be different from a Jewish education that comes from a synagogue or a school or some other place of Jewish education that we may be familiar with from our own childhoods. So without further ado, let's jump into the conversation. Hahn Tapper, welcome to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to have you.
Thank you very much for this opportunity.
So, as you know, this is a series on Jewish education, and I promise our listeners that we'll get to education more explicitly later on in the conversation. But I wanted to start with your work and your book, Judaisms, because I think that one of the questions implicit in our discussion of education that's been coming up a lot is education towards what? You know, what is the Judaism that we're educating toward, about? I'm not even sure what the right verb is. So I think it's actually a really helpful place to start to talk about this idea that it's difficult to conceive of an educational program when you're not even sure what the it is. And yet, as I sort of understand your work and your book, you're making the claim that in some ways there never really has been an it. And so I'd love if you could go into some detail about your perspective, and then we can dive into some of the specific examples.
So the general premise of the book is that there is no single definition of what it means to be a Jew, and that's always been the case, that there's been heterogeneity from the inception, if you want to date that inception to some sort of perceived or imagined or factual, who knows, notion of Bible as history, or moving forward into Israelites and Judeans and Jews and et cetera, that when people talk about Jews, whether it's Jews or the other 99.8% of the world that isn't Jewish, talks about Jews, it's as if there's some sort of notion of what it means to be a Jew. And obviously that's a problem in talking about the identity of any group. All of us, that's how we simplify when we talk about that family or that community or that race or ethnicity or religion. But given that I primarily wrote this book for people to learn about what it means to be Jewish, first and foremost, I put out there that there are only answers to that question as opposed to one answer. And even though in specific times and places there are dominant notions, those dominant notions can literally change overnight.
So given that, I guess where my mind goes is to this question of some things are clearly Jewish and some things are clearly not Jewish. Some things that were once Jewish, like, let's say, Christianity, are no longer Jewish. That somehow, and some things that were once Jewish sort of withered on the vine and went away. And I wonder if there's some kind of pattern to this, if there's some kind of way of making sense of the notion that there are times in which people think that they can define what it means to be Jewish, at least at a given time, whether that given time is in the present or in the past. And yet we can still understand this notion that there wasn't always only one and it wasn't always the same one. I mean, how do we manage the question of there being more than one legitimate form of Judaism while at the same time having some sense that Judaism is actually a thing and not something else?
So that essentially is the question. If you're talking about what is meat, how do you define meat versus how do you define milk when you get into issues related to dietary laws that many Jews are concerned about? When does meat stop being meat? Well, if you put it in your mouth, does it stop being meat? You have to chew it. And literally the rabbis in the Talmud go on arguably way too long when they're talking about all sorts of things like that. And my intellect can be like, oh, well, actually, who knows if that is Jewish or not? Whereas my social being per se is like, oh, well, of course that is. The archetypal Jew, at least for much of the latter 20th century in the United States of America, pop culture, someone like Woody Allen, right? So are people going to argue that Woody Allen's not Jewish? Put aside all of the problematics and challenges of his life and his biography and all of that. Just in terms of, an Ashkenazi, Nebuchadnezzar, New York Jew, certainly in Northern California, many of the speakers I bring to the University of San Francisco to meet with my students are the farthest thing from Woody Allen. Now, I have my own biases of what I think is more obvious than not in terms of what it means to be a Jew. But again, those are like really limited individual social biases that are really nothing compared to a notion of, oh, well, actually, that is one of many ways of being Jewish. So that's maybe an academic and long-winded way of saying, I don't know, to your original question, Daniel. I mean, I'm not sure. Let's walk around Macy's and are we going to point to certain objects or people? Are they Jewish and not Jewish? And I certainly have those biases. That said, if I'm teaching something to students, I'd like to think I can also step outside of those biases and be like, well, actually, I don't know. I don't know if that's any more or less Jewish than this other object or this other person. So then how do you teach what it means to be a Jew? I think one core thing that is missing in many Jewish educational settings is teaching things along the lines of this is the way some Jews do X. All too often, whether we're talking nursery school, grade school, high school, even universities, but less so on university campuses, hopefully, things are taught in terms of this is how Jews do X or this is how Jews do Y. And A, it's not accurate. It's just not factual. But B, it also marginalizes anything other than this narrow strain of what one is saying is the way it is done by that group, i.e. Jews, which has a social justice or rather social injustice to it by marginalizing other forms of Jewish expression and performance.
If there's a listener out there who's thinking to themselves, okay, so some people talk about Judaism, some people talk about Judaisms, and like, I sort of get it. Like, one is saying that there's some diversity, but like, what does it really matter? Like, why is it such a big deal to talk about Judaism as if it is a coherent whole, WH, not a whole of emptiness. If somebody's listening and thinking like, okay, I get what you're saying, but like, is it really so bad to, for practical purposes, talk about Judaism without that plural? What would you say to that person? And just hammering home the power, hammering home what you just identified in terms of how when you talk about Judaism, by definition, you have to make choices about what is in it, who is in it, and who is out of it, what is out of it. Why should we be dubious of that?
Listen, in the Judaisms book, the first 10 chapters, I attempt to both explain what I consider to be dominant notions of what it means to be a Jew over not just 20th and 21st century, but over time, dominant notions in given places and times. And then chapter 11, called Borders, I say, okay, it seems maybe I've deconstructed what it means to be a Jew to the point where anything's on the table. Well, let's look at what I'm going to call loosely, just for the purposes of being able to have some sort of language, border communities. Let's look at these border communities that kind of flesh out, are there any borders to what it means to be a Jew? And really, I don't answer any of that. Whether we're talking about Jesus-believing Jews, commonly called Messianic Jews, or Black Hebrew Israelites of Jerusalem, African Hebrew Israelites of Jerusalem. To someone who might say to you, Lex, well, what does it matter? I would say, when we're talking about the Jewish community, we have a community that, for understandable reasons, is living in a place and time in the United States and state of Israel, where 80% of all Jews in the world live, that this is a traumatized people that has been on the receiving end of genocide in the lifetime of grandparents, great-grandparents. It's a community that worries about its future always and constantly, at least in my lifetime, always and constantly. And if that is part of the expression of the trauma of Jews to worry about survival, then it seems to me that wherever you are on the political spectrum, the response to that would be, well, don't you want to widen the tent? It just seems to me logical. We worry Jews about survival and instilling Jewish identity in the next generations. Okay, so then why are you talking about the Jews as if they're this monolithic, Ashkenazi, heteronormative, male-centric, patriarchal thing, as opposed to the diversity of Jews that includes various forms of gender expression and Jewish identities from across the globe? You know, there's that intention of why it's important. Another intention is because when one talks about the Jewish way to do something, like I said before, you're marginalizing the lesser known, not even necessarily lesser practiced, but lesser known ways of Jews expressing that other forms of Jewish identity. And if you are on the receiving end of marginalization, you know, it's very easy to say, well, of course it matters. It matters to me because you're discounting me and my sub-community. If you're part of the dominant group, you might very well not care or just be completely oblivious to how you're marginalizing other subgroups within Judaism. And those are just two, you know, then there's the historical accuracy part of it. But it matters on multiple levels, whether in terms of social injustice or not, and it matters in terms of, well, if you want this people to thrive and survive, then you need to stop limiting what you mean by this people, these people, that it's much wider than this small, narrow scope.
I remember growing up, I thought of one side of my family as sort of like deeply Jewish and the other side as like not. One side of my family, you know, I have that grandfather set of tefillin. I knew that they like sort of went to a conservative synagogue regularly. The other side of my family, like very actively was not into what we would term religious life, was not a group of people that lived their lives around the cycle of the Torah portions or around any of those pieces. Now I'm going to say what that side of the family was. They were socialist Jews living in the Catskills of New York. Almost all of their friends and family were also Jews. And I started, as I got into college and older, to hear these stories of like friends of mine, their grandparents also were socialists, also in New York. And like all of a sudden in me, I felt this sense of like, oh, this is a Jewish narrative. And so I want to ask about that, because why did I need that? Or like, why do people need that? What happens when we find ourselves in the past seems of deep consequence to us. And like something about me felt more connected to Judaism because I saw my family as like a common story and not just like a random set of people who disregarded Judaism. So I'm like curious what's happening there. But like, how can our consciousness expand, and how can our visions of what Judaism is sort of permitted to be through a Jewish lens, like how can that expand when we recognize that S at the end of Judaism, that Judaism's instead of one Judaism?
A number of thoughts. One is approaching that question from within the Jewish enclave, and we're pretending that there's boundaries to whatever that means. Right? Given that statistically, at least, most Jewish Americans are partnering off with non-Jews. So the first part of that, which is obviously in talking about two wings of a family that are both Jewish, I think there's some sort of psychological need that humans have, that we have, to identify with something that has a history, whether the history goes back a couple hundred years, which is usually the extent to which any one of us can trace ourselves. Ancestry.com can only take you so far, right? It can only take you at best to the 1800s, once in a blue moon, the 1700s. But most of our understanding of identity is imagined insofar as maybe it's an educated guess, but we really don't know. So when your scope of understanding of Jewish identity widens so that you could start incorporating that wing of your family that seemed less Jewish, so to speak, when you were a kid, the socialist wing, and then you started realizing, oh, they're just as Jewish as this ritually observant wing, I think that's probably very empowering to somebody insofar as them understanding, oh, well, there's more than one authentic way to be a Jew. Now, when you take it beyond the scope of the Jewish community, it gets even more potentially problematic and more potentially profound. So I attended Jewish private school, Jewish parochial school for 13 years. And in grade school, I believe it was second or third grade, I think it was second, we did one of these timelines where the teachers put up some map of the world and we had to use yarn to like trace ourselves back. We were being taught, oh, that's where your people are from, even though, on my dad's side, they go back to Lithuania and Latvia, as far as we know, a couple hundred years at best, is a bit most we can trace. And my mom converted to Judaism. My mom's lineage was completely erased from the assignment, that the teacher literally said to her, that's not what we're doing in this. I doubt she used such educationally based language, but that's not the pedagogical underpinnings of this lesson plan, right? She probably said something along the lines of, that's not part of this exercise because that's not a Jewish lens. Now, there's obvious problems to that many of your listeners that'll just speak to them right away. For those who don't have a viscerally uncomfortable reaction to that and be like, oh, well, they were teaching Jewish history and non-Jews don't, that's not part of Jewish history. I would say my family history on my mom's side is part of the Jewish story. Because Jews have always been interacting with quote unquote non-Jews, with the 99.8% of the planet that isn't Jewish, that interaction is part of the Jewish story. It's a loss when, at a Jewish day school, and I would not be surprised if that type of approach was still, that type of response by a teacher was still given. So the layering to your anecdote is both within the Jewish community, and then how much are you going to widen that even to include non-Jews? And then we get back to Daniel's question. All right, well, kind of these foundational questions. Well, is that a non-Jewish, and is this Jewish? And some of it just has to do, simply put, with how people identify.
One thing that I've been reflecting on lately is if we believe in a sense of peoplehood such that I or you or us are connected to a group of people a few thousand years ago, or let's say even less, like 1,000 years, that also identified as Jews, or before that as Israelites or something. Like, if we believe that we actually are connected to those people, then we have to be connected to that whole people. So we're just as connected to Moses as we are to all the people Moses is fetching about. And we're just as connected to the rabbis as, and maybe I should frame it in the other way. We're just as reflected to all the people the rabbis are complaining about not following the rules as we are to the rabbis who are saying what they deem the rules to be. And I bring that up for a variety of reasons. One is I think there's some language things that come up in how people talk about Judaism today that I really want to think twice about. We say these statements that are wrong. We say Jews light candles on Friday night. Like, if you walk into a Sunday school classroom all around, and I'm stealing this from our conversation with Ari Moffick, by the way, a long time ago, lots of Jews don't light candles on Friday night. My guess is if you were to measure the population of whether it's 5.5 million or 7.5 million, whichever survey you trust on the population, like if you were to actually see what all of the American Jews were doing on a Friday night, there are fewer lighting Shabbat candles than there are not lighting Shabbat candles. To say descriptively that Jews do X when most of them don't is something I have a problem with. I don't have a problem with saying many Jews do that. I don't have a problem with saying even many Jews do that, and historically it has been a centralized ritual by certain folks that is what you are prescribed to do on Friday night. But what I'm not okay with is saying, like, it's Jewish to do candle lighting on Friday night, and if you're not doing that, you're sort of not doing the Jewish. I'm using crass language, but like there's this deeply embedded idea that people have that sort of, there is a Judaism. Look, like I might not do it. I might not go to synagogue Saturday morning. I might not celebrate X holiday. I might not eat kosher food, but like non-kosher food is less Jewish than kosher food. This is flashing to Rachel Gross's conversation with us, your neighbor in Jewish Studies, San Francisco. Given that given that many of us accept your presumption that we need to revisit how we conceptualize Jewish history to think of plural Judaism, like how would that affect how we talk about Jewish rituals and practices today, and sort of what Judaism is or what Jewishness connotes?
I remember having a conversation, and really it wasn't something I gave serious thought to until college, which speaks to the limits of my mindset and or the way I was socialized growing up and what I was taught. But the question I was asked, well, do you think it's more Jewish on a Saturday morning to go to a synagogue and pray with a quorum of Jews and use one of the standard Jewish prayer books, Sidurim, or to meet with your youth group, specifically on the Saturday morning, on Shabbat, on the Jewish Sabbath, and doing acts of what we could frame as tikkun olam, transforming the world or healing the world, such as working in a homeless shelter or helping get clothes to people without clothes, or protesting against immigration policies, or what have you. And it's hard to remember what I would have thought 30 years ago. But I think my response was, no, the first thing, going into a synagogue is more Jewish. And now I sit from a different place. I would say, one intention seems to be a little bit more cookie cutter, very clear to answer yes. Well, going to a synagogue, a Jewish specified and Jewish identified house of worship, using a Jewish identified and specified prayer book, praying with a group of people that also identifies Jewish, right? That one's a lot clearer Well, what about the other one where you're meeting specifically with other Jews from a youth group of a synagogue, right? And you're engaging in acts of tikkun olam, transforming the world. Both can be Jewish, and, to simply go through the ritual observances of, to use your example from before, a practice of Jews to light Friday night Sabbath candles and to go to synagogue on the Jewish Sabbath and pray with other Jews. Yeah, that's more of a textbook way of understanding one's Jewish identity. But if you're not also getting out and about in the world, for me, I would say that you're missing out. When we get back to how it's not just Moses, but I would need to identify with all of the people who identify with as a group, part of Group X. I've thought about that. Do I identify more with an ultra-Orthodox Jew in the Jewish neighborhood of Mea She'arim in Jerusalem than I do with, say, my Jewish neighbor who is not ritually observant? Or do I identify with them more compared to non-Jews that I interact with? Hands down, I identify much more with the ritually non-observant Jew and the non-Jew more than I do to the ultra-Orthodox Jew in Mea She'arim. So I understand that if you identify as part of X, in this case Jewish, then everyone else who identifies as Jewish is part of your community. I get that. But there are despicable behaviors exhibited by Jews in the last 10, 20 years in the United States of America, people who are infamous, who have made the news for pedophilia, for stealing money, and on and on. And I don't even need to say their names. People can fill in the blank. Unfortunately, it's not necessarily obvious who I'm talking about. Do I identify, are they part of my community? Yes, they identify as Jewish. I identify as Jewish, so we're part of the same community, just like ultra-Orthodox Jews that probably would not even accept me as a Jew, given that my mom's conversion was not necessarily by the standards that they would accept. But so what? It gets down to, who one identifies more with. And I identify more with non-Jews who we have a shared sense of values than I do with Jews who we don't have a sense of shared values.
I mean, this gets into a long-running debate or discussion that Lex and I have been having about whether we should describe Judaism as what Lex calls a library, meaning that these are all the things that Judaism has been and is, and you can fairly say are Jewish, versus, what I've been saying aspirationally, at least, and I think to some extent Lex also agrees with this, we're hoping for a Judaism, or Lex sort of agrees, doesn't maybe, he's doing the so-so symbol, that at least I'll speak for myself, that I aspire to limit what is defined as Judaism for the future, meaning I want there to be a definition of a Judaism where if you're trying to somehow claim that it justifies stealing money or pedophilia, that I want to say, like, well, no, you're not part of my community. And so maybe we need a different word, or maybe we declare a schism and wherever the most people go wins. But it does feel like there are these points in history where, let's say, the definitional weight of the community's understanding of what it is to be a member of this community moves forward in a way that actually does chop a piece off and exclude it. And I suppose that one of the issues is that, are we then going to retroject and claim that that group that got lopped off never was part of us in the first place? That would be untrue. But it feels like there is some need or some aspiration to say, but as we look forward, can we limit it, right? Because, and for me, what's at stake is that a Judaism that is attractive to me is one that stands for something, one that is about a certain set of values, not a certain people. From my perspective, I don't care what your personal genetic background is or any kind of background. I'm looking to have a thing that we kind of accept and believe in, and that makes us better people. And so if you want to move forward and say, well, I can make a justification for stealing money based on some kind of interpretation of Judaism, then my response would be, well, let me try to redefine this a little bit tighter so that you can't actually make that claim, because I don't want to be part of a community where people can take its value system and pervert it to do something really bad.
You know, what I'm thinking of is, so I teach a course in the fall based loosely on well, not loosely, pretty tightly on the book Judaisms. And it's a special class for first semester students. So it's their first year in college, it's a seminar. And other than the first and last weeks of the semester, every week I have class off campus at a site of importance to Jews. So for instance, dealing with chapter 1 called Narratives, we have class at the JCC of San Francisco. And I have class, and then we also meet with a representative from the JCC, and we talk about how this physical space at the JCC is kind of an intersection of Jewish and non-Jewish life. Or when we do Sinai's, chapter 2, we go to Congregation Emmanuel, which architecturally is built more explicitly like a temple, like the temple, so to speak, than most synagogues or many synagogues, where it has a place that you could wash your hands, and then it goes down and then back up. And it's as if the Torah scrolls are held with the Ark of the Covenant, and it's very reflective, right? Okay, so for the chapter 4 is called Messiahs, and I've done different things with the students over the years. But what I think I'm going to do this year is actually take them to our church on campus. It's a Catholic church, and like many, if not most Catholic churches, has very detailed iconography of Jesus. But what I want to really drive home for them is that you can orient towards Jesus in all sorts of ways, you know, as the Son of God, as dominant Christian perspectives. But another way you could orient towards Jesus is as a Jewish Messiah. And you could orient towards the early Christians in terms of being another Jewish community. Now, that's a radical idea for most, whether they're Jews, Christians, or anyone under the sun, because most people like drawing this family tree where it's just this limb goes right off, right? And it's not clear whatsoever that it was so finite. And all right, in the year 142, all of these, we started calling these Jesus-believing Jews Christians, or obviously nothing like that happened. But the reason I want to take them to the church is I'm going to ask them, and there'll be, about a third of our students are Catholic, some believing Catholic, some not. I'm going to ask you to orient differently when you walk into the church. For those of you who have been to a church, I want to ask you to try to, at least for 10 minutes of time, try to think of Jesus in a different light. And I think it responds to your question because, right, there's this whole article by Rabbi Byron Sherwin of Jesus as a failed versus a false Messiah. And that even from a standpoint of Jewish law, from a standpoint of halakha, a failed Messiah is different than a false Messiah. A false Messiah, from a Jewish perspective, is one who never had the potential to be the Messiah and was kind of a charlatan, as opposed to a failed Messiah is a Messiah that had the potential to be the Messiah, but it didn't happen. But it also gets back to this question of, so then do we cut the limb off and say, no, we don't, because I'm not a historian and I don't know nearly as much as Daniel Boyan, who's a giant. But I'm going to lean towards that perspective in what I'm going to teach my students, of thinking about this community, that this community actually included what we would now call Christians, but there were Christian Jews and non-Christian Jews living side by side, and that it's not so neat and tidy, that most of history is incredibly messy. Things can be taught, and certainly in the seminaries in the yeshivot I learned in were taught that, okay, so 5 books of Moses were given to Moses on Mount Sinai, and the letter, word for word, letter for letter, what we have in the Torah scroll today is that, and the Mishnah that is the embodiment and the concretization of the oral law that was also given to Moses on Mount Sinai. And we know that because it says so right here, which the cyclical logic isn't usually taught of how do we know that the Mishnah is the oral Torah? Because it says so in the Mishnah. How do we know that the Torah was given by God to Moses? Because it says so in the Torah, right? Part of me would love to believe that and all of this simple way of taking it. And anyway, I'll stop there.
I very frequently am like on the soapbox. Hopefully this will land well, like trying to convince people that the idea of Judaism and not Judaisms, or at least not some other set of ideas about, like the idea of one coherent group that has traveled its way through history and been Judaism. I spend a lot of time trying to deconstruct that. And what I succeed at a lot of the times is, I'll name to people, all sorts of Jewish holidays that we practice. It's very clear, sort of historically, that they started outside of, quote unquote Judaism. They were started by groups that did not self-identify or weren't identified by others as Jewish. And then, Israelites or Jews sort of latched on and made a Jewish version of that holiday or that ritual, etc. And people are A, not all that surprised by that, and B, often convinced. And they're like, okay, so like I can buy that Hanukkah seems to connect to like a winter solstice situation, light in the middle of winter, even if there's these other, like I can buy all that. But then when I keep pushing, often what happens is instead of fully embracing what that would mean, it's like I'll bring up a Jewish practice. I'll bring up, say, dreidel, another Hanukkah one. So dreidel clearly started, it was like a spinning top game in German and Irish pubs that then Hebrew letters are put on them and sort of some meaning was applied to it. And they'll be like, oh, so now I know that dreidel's not really a Jewish ritual. And I'm like, well, what if the whole idea of a Jewish ritual that like must start and end in this bubble, like what if that's actually not how it works? What if something being Jewish doesn't necessarily mean that it started Jewish and stayed Jewish, but it actually is allowed to sort of start in some other place and migrate its way in? And so I want to ask that open-ended. It's clear where my biases are, but it's also, like you said, really messy, because I don't want people to then just go and steal rituals from all sorts of cultures and be like, yep, yoga's Jewish now. But I do want to recognize on some level that this is how historically it's unfolded. So like, how could we filter our way through that set of conversations and think about the difference between like origins and, I don't know, identity or current reality?
One of the famous writers, scholars, theoreticians on religion, J.Z. Smith, in a book, he talks about ritual called To Take Place. There's two basic ways of understanding towards sacredness, right? One is a J.Z. Smith approach, talking about, well, this bottle or this water, say, is sacred because we say it's sacred, so it's sacred. Another is to actually believe that it's inherently, intrinsically, maybe even scientifically sacred, right? So if we're talking about two glasses of water, one is holy water, one is a plain glass of water. So for a believing Catholic, the holy water, so what's the difference? Well, a priest has prayed over it and what have you. So some believing Catholics think, oh, well, there's something inherently, intrinsically more sacred, more valuable, more divine maybe of the glass of holy water as opposed to a glass of regular water. I'm more of the orientation that we assign meaning to things, that meaning has meaning because we say it has meaning. I mean, it's certainly not my idea, and it's very postmodern, and that there isn't necessarily an inherent quality to anything unless we give it that quality, so to speak. I say to my students at USF, imagine we set aside this one chair in the classroom and nobody's going to sit in that chair. And over the course of weeks of time, we will start orienting to the chair as if the chair has some sort of inherent properties. If I was a historian of cultural artifacts and really wanted to get into, the origins of a dreidel or anything, can it be traced back even prior to Germans and Irish folk? Is there some sort of origin of a spinning top that preceded that, right? I would say I mean, I would agree with you ultimately. Like, a dreidel is Jewish. Now, a spinning top can be Jewish, can be a Jewish ritual or used as a Jewish ritual, but isn't necessarily so. And Jews certainly don't have the, challah bread, as Ashkenazi Jewish Americans talk about it, as if like, oh, that's so quintessentially Jewish. And then, you walk around Poland and you see what is so-called challah bread as bread. More often than not, we assign identity to things, and it becomes more problematic when there's power differentials involved in who's doing the assigning. I don't know. Those are just some thoughts on that one.
In the time that we have remaining, let's segue to the topic of education, because I think that it's actually striking me as we're having this conversation that the opportunity to actually hear the approach to Jewish education that you're articulating, which is like, let me actually tell you the real history of Judaism, the real story of Judaism that contains so much more than any of these particular streams are going to teach you. That opportunity comes when somebody gets to college and where there are Jewish studies classes available to them. And I would love to hear you reflect a little bit on the responsibility that you may or may not accept. I think you accept it, but many other Jewish studies professors resist the idea that they're somehow playing a role in Jewish education. And yet, for many Jews, I think their Jewish education is coming from these folks. So it's an interesting situation that I wonder both how we might think about university education differently, perhaps how we might take what happens in Jewish studies programs in university and bring them into the classroom in a better way for children, or whatever you might think about. But I'm wondering if you could reflect on this challenge that I think a Jewish education that really would resonate with people, that we certainly get from the podcast, is one where people say, "Oh, I didn't know that." It's amazing to know that it wasn't always the case that only people with a Jewish mother were considered Jewish. That completely changes my life. It makes me feel like an authentic Jew, and yet they really, in many cases, have no way of hearing that other than if they took a Jewish studies course, and then you talk to the professor in the Jewish studies course and they say, "Oh, I'm an academic, I don't want to mix that up with advocacy." And that's a difficult situation. So I'm wondering where things are today and where you think they might go.
So in terms of whether or not an academic teaching a course related to Jewish studies is involved in Jewish education, to some degree that gets back to almost every other thread we've been talking about. Insofar as if the person says it's not, then okay, like, fine. If that professor says they're not engaged in Jewish education, I don't know what my dog is in the fight to argue with them. I know that I absolutely consider it Jewish education, and I consider it Jewish education on my campus largely more often than not as Jewish education to non-Jews. So University of San Francisco is one of the most diverse campuses in the country. Depends on the year, but previous years we've been ranked, say, top 5 in terms of racial and ethnic diversity, in terms of first-generation university students, and in terms of first-generation American who are university students, in terms of international students. So we have an incredibly rich and diverse campus. And it's also San Francisco. So in terms of spectrum of variances of gender and sexual orientation, you see that more than you do necessarily in other pockets of the country, because I think there's a certain space for people to enact or perform or explore those various pieces of their identities in San Francisco, as opposed to other places that are much more constricting. Probably 2 or 3% of our students are Jewish, which is a pretty small percentage. Our class is capped at 40. So in a given Jewish studies course that I teach, we usually have, say, out of 40 students, maybe 5 who I either identify strongly as Jewish or they identify one of their grandparents as Jewish, and they end up in this course kind of exploring what it means to be a Jew. But it's Jewish education not only because it's teaching Jews about what it means to be a Jew, but it's also more reflective of the larger Jewish education taking place, say, in the United States of America, is towards non-Jews. And to have a a well-received, but also a loud voice on campus of, our Jewish Studies and Social Justice program, a prominent place on campus to teach non-Jews about Jews is, I think, not the norm of what people think about Jewish education. And I think the Jewish community is well behind the curve on not supporting programs like that because, in terms of basics, going back to some of the things we talked about earlier, and those who orient towards Jewish identities and as a saga of survival and that type of thing, well, a basic survival mechanism, if you are a minority, is to make alliances with the majority, right? That's also just basic rationale. So if you're 0.2% of the planet Earth, wouldn't you want to make strong alliances with the other 99.8%? But over the course of the last 12 years, I've learned that to some degree, in strange ways, we in the Jewish Studies and Social Justice program at USF have become inadvertent proselytizers and missionaries. And what I mean by that is because it's Northern California, there's a disproportionate number of USF students that are from the state of California and from the San Francisco Bay Area. Because Jewish families in California and Northern California are disproportionately represented with non-Jews in the families, we have a handful and a disproportionate number of students who identify as Jewish in our courses, right? Who might have one grandparent. So I'm thinking of a couple of students who, both of them, identified loosely as Jewish, one less than the other. So one of them, she knew her grandfather was Jewish and she kind of identified as Jewish, but wasn't really sure. And another one who was raised who her father was Jewish, mom wasn't, and she was raised Catholic, her mom's religion. The first student came in, didn't really have a strong identity, so Jewish was one of her identities. And she ended up really, the course resonating with her, and she went on, she's a Jewish Studies and Social Justice minor now. And I have no doubts that she identifies as Jewish, much stronger than she did prior. And what does that even mean? I don't know. If we let her self-evaluate on a 1 to 10 scale, I'm sure it went up. And then the other student I'm thinking of, her mom's Catholic, dad's Jewish, raised Catholic, but she ended up in the Jewish Studies course, right? She, during the semester, voiced that she does not identify as Jewish. She identified as Catholic. And then following semester, she was in touch with me because she had joined this Jewish student organization on campus and had decided to be one of the board members or whatever, like a president or vice president. Now, I'm not engaging in Jewish education necessarily it was never my intention when I came to the University of San Francisco to bring these people towards the Jewish people. And I think one of the main reasons it has happened that way is because, I learned growing up, you could be Jewish according to the Reform movement if you're, aside from conversion, if your father was Jewish, patrilineal descent or matrilineal descent. And I was raised a conservative Jew, and I was like, no, it was only matrilineal or conversion. So when I learned that when I was in my 20s and much later in life, learned, it's not like the Reform movement just decided, how can we be more inclusive? That they actually are rooting that opinion in Jewish history. Wow. That was mind-blowing to me that I had never known that, yeah, of course, because it never occurred to me, like, obviously it's patriarchal in terms of the Torah, let alone putting aside there are no Jews in the Torah. There's only Hebrews and Israelites, right? So, but anyway, the fact that, Jewish history is much more big tent than those with Orthodox, and I mean that as a adjective, Orthodox or conservative, small c conservative, or more narrow understandings of Jewish identity have. That the big tent approach is actually not my approach per se. It's what I would say is that's Jewish history, and I'm just kind of reflecting on it in Judaisms. So in terms of Jewish education at a Jesuit Catholic university like the University of San Francisco, it's kind of multi-layered work where we're informing and educating Jews about Jewish identities and non-Jews about Jewish identities, and those individuals who have one foot in a Jewish world and a non-Jewish world because of how they were raised and the identities of their families. We also educate them about Jews and Judaisms. That, I'm not even sure how one could argue that it's not Jewish education. I now I've convinced myself that you can't do that, but you certainly can't in my courses on my campus.
Nice. So I love that you named that moment of mind blowing with matrilineal descent, patrilineal descent. That there was this, group that was drawing on rich treasure trove of Jewish history to make that argument. It wasn't just coming out of nowhere. My moment like that was walking up to a booth at a Jewish Federation's General Assembly, walking up to this guy who's now a friend of mine named Sean, and I know you know him because he's mentioned in your book, and learning that there was this group of Jews with a long history. I mean, at the very least, you could say 1,000, 1,200 years, but like actually there's arguments that it's longer than that. They don't think the new year is in the fall. They think it's in the spring. There are entire holidays that I learned were Jewish holidays that they don't celebrate. There are rituals they do that I don't do. They do mix meat and milk. They all of these things that, like, the basic bedrock of what I thought was Jewish was challenged in that moment. It was like, oh, my mind is blown. And then almost immediately I was thrilled by that because it was liberating. It was actually saying to me, like, oh, this Judaism or Judaisms now, I would have said Judaism then, like this Judaism thing that I'm a part of, it has the potential to be so much broader than I thought because there's this like ancient group, Karaites, that is totally doing things entirely differently. So I guess this is a closing kind of question, like, why should we be excited to have our minds blown? Why should we be thrilled and not nervous at the idea that there are a plurality, there are many, many different Judaisms? Why, if we still haven't convinced listeners, I think you've been very persuasive, but like, why should people not resist this fact and try to paint over the incredible diversity that has imbued itself into every era of Jewish history? Why instead should they be thrilled and excited at that prospect?
So a few reasons. One is because it's reflective of reality. Two, because wouldn't you rather go into a museum, say, and see all different types of painting than the same exact painting? I believe it might have been Abraham Joshua Heschel who said something about you go into a museum, you don't want to see the same painting in every room. You would want to see variety. I mean, that's more exciting. It's much more exciting to have people express themselves in different ways than in one way. The most mind-blowing thing probably I've had in terms of my Jewish education in my lifetime was when I spent the summer, I had the opportunity and privilege studying in Morocco for a summer. I spent a weekend, I was studying in Fez, Morocco, but I was able to spend a weekend in Marrakesh. And not uncommonly, when I go to foreign countries, I am much more synagogue observant than at home, because I'm interested in how these people, in these so-called other people, express their Jewish identities, and the synagogue is a basic way you can see that. So I'm in Marrakesh, and I go to the old city of Marrakesh and find out where the synagogue is. And most of the guys in the synagogue looked Arab. Now, I was in my mid-20s, and on some level that's like, yeah, you're in an Arab majority country, or the two Arab identity is the largest identity in Morocco, and then you have Berbers and others. But why wouldn't you have Arab Jews, right? The notion of an Arab Jew just never totally made sense, largely because of my Ashkenazi-centric understanding of what it meant to be a Jew. And my mind was blown because the guys in this synagogue looked like every other guy on the street in the old city of Marrakesh, where a kuf on their head, which for them was a kippah, not a Muslim head covering, but a Jewish one. And they were wearing a full-on, in Morocco, a jalabia, kind of like a big robe. And more to the point, when we spoke to one another in Hebrew, their Hebrew accent was so different than any other Hebrew accent I'd ever heard, that we were at the end of services, they were asking me if I was going to come back for afternoon services. And the guy kept saying, minha, minha, minha. I absolutely know. And then finally, it was like, duh, he's saying mincha, in my Ashkenazi-centric. And of course, then all of a sudden, all these things coalesced, like, oh, that's why Yemenites, because now I was studying Arabic, that's why Yemenites say wa. And like all Yemenite Jews, all of these different things came together in my head. But it was on some level mind-blowing. And there is a piece of me that is ashamed that it took me till my 20s for the paradigm and the archetype of what I thought it meant to be a Jew was blown up. And all of a sudden, you can be an Arab Muslim, an Arab Christian. Why can't you be an Arab Jew? Judaism is such a rich, diverse thing. And there's so many different ways of expressing Jewish identity that it's on so many different levels lacking to not understand that Judaism is not monolithic. And understanding the connections that I have to that Moroccan Jewish guy enriches my Jewish identity because, among other reasons, that's probably more reflective of how Jews have engaged in synagogue prayer for most of Jewish history, much more so than American synagogues are reflective of it.
Thank you so much for joining us. This has been a fantastic conversation.
Thank you both. It was it's nice to have a conversation with people about these ideas. I'm usually just a geeked out academic, and my kids, God knows, don't want to hear me talk about this stuff.
Well, we are glad that we were able to talk about the things that kids are entirely uninterested. No, hopefully some kids are interested in this, but we're glad to be able to geek out together, and we hope that all of you out there listening have enjoyed this episode as well. We want to close it out in the same way that we always do, by encouraging you to be in touch with us, and there are a wide variety of ways for you to do that. First, you can head to our Facebook page, Judaism Unbound. Second, you can go to our Twitter feed at Judaism Unbound. Third, you can go to our website, JudaismUnbound.com. And last but not least, you can always hit us up via email at dan@JudaismUnbound.com or lex@JudaismUnbound.com. The last request we like to make is that we deeply appreciate any amount of financial donation that you can set aside and send our way. And you can do that at JudaismUnbound.com/donate with either a monthly recurring donation or a one-time gift. So thank you so much for listening. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.